In the next 10 years, $10 trillion will probably change hands across family businesses in North America. That number is higher when you take into consideration family businesses that are really large in Asia, in the Middle East, in Africa as well. Why am I telling you this? Because I've noticed that there's a quiet crisis happening when it's time for these intergenerational transfers in family businesses. My name is Uyai. I've spent years working with family businesses and multi-generational businesses of all sizes. Let me paint a picture for you. Imagine that you have a business that's in its third generation. Let's say the founder started a business, he passed it on to his son, and now his son is 68 and wants to retire. That son has two children, a daughter and a son. The son works in finance across the country. The daughter has been helping out with the business as well as owning her own pursuits. Now, who's the most obvious person to take over that business? Is it the son in finance, or is it the daughter who has also spent time in the business and also has her own things that she's doing? For many generations, it would automatically go to the son. Now, before you come from me, I do know that this does not happen in all businesses. It doesn't happen in all cultures. I truly respect the fact that every family is different. But for so long, it was the default for the son to take over the business so that we could keep it in the family. Okay, now, why is that? That's because of patriarchy. That's because of people's cultures. That's because people used to be worried about diluting their family wealth by, the woman marrying out of the family, right? And, in some cultures and in some families, people still think that way. But what I want to do in this series of videos is show you a different way for this to be a success if your daughters want to be part of the business. Now, over the next decade, we're going to really see a really large wealth transfer, right? This is probably one of the largest wealth transfers that we've ever seen in human history, right? And we have to account for the fact that the world that we are moving into is not the same as the way that we've been looking at businesses and successions for the last 100, 200, even I don't know how long people have had the generational businesses, but 500 years, So we have to kind of start thinking about these transitions differently, especially if you have daughters that are keen on getting into the business, daughters that are kind of willing and capable, and they want to take that step up to begin to run the business. Now, here's where it gets interesting. When I started working with family offices and these large family businesses, sometimes the sons and daughters were being prepared differently. Sons were sometimes invited to the board meetings from the young age of 22. They were introduced to the bankers, they were introduced to the family lawyers, they were introduced to the wealth planners, the people who would kind of help with making those big external decisions. Daughters were often working in the business, so they would work operations, they would work HR. These are very important roles, right? There's nothing wrong with working in these roles. There's nothing wrong with working in the business. However, some of those really key and strategic decisions are made when you're meeting with the wealth managers, when you're meeting with the lawyers, when you're meeting with the key business partners, the ones that, if they sneeze, you have to say bless you. The ones that if they say jump, you have to ask how high, And so if you're meeting, there's a difference in the way that you view the business if you are meeting with those key partners from when you're very young, from when you're 22, you're 25, and you know what he likes, what, the family does, his kids' names. There's a difference in knowing those key partners and keeping them in your Rolodex, so to speak, versus working in HR and operations alone, which although they're very important, sometimes it doesn't give you the full view of how those strategic decisions are made. Now, this isn't about bad intentions. Sometimes it's just a blind spot that families have, right? So they don't intend to sideline their daughters. They don't intend to treat them differently, but sometimes historical has shown that that's how women were treated in previous generations, right? And so you have to be able to get to a place where you're okay, well, I can do this a little bit better. I want this to change. So what happens when dad retires, or what happens when he decides to, take a step back, or what happens when an unfortunate life event like illness or death happens. So the family scramble. Sometimes they have to bring in an outside CEO who has a strategic partnering experience, or sometimes they have to, like, they're forced to like rely on the son who was exposed to those partners and may or may not be the actual best person to run the business. Now, if he is, that's wonderful. But I'm speaking to the cases where the daughter is probably, like, she could be a better person to run the business. So let me tell you what this costs. First, there's an obvious financial cost. When you bring in outside leadership, there's a lot of pressure for them to like perform well, for them to like succeed, for them to kind of turn the business around. It may or may not align with the way the business has been run. There's also the cost to the daughter herself, right? I've worked with women who spend years trying to prove themselves within the business, only to watch the opportunity slip away from them because someone felt that they were not ready for the strategic part of running the business. That is a kind of pain that she will probably carry for the rest of her life. Okay, now there's a cost to the business too, because here's the truth. The leadership skills that built businesses in the 70s, in the 80s, and the 50s, they're not the same skills that we need going forward in this new dispensation of AI, in this new dispensation where like AI automates everything, but where soft skills are still important. You still have to remember to be human, right? So everything that got us here in the 70s and the 80s is not everything that's going to carry us forward. They're kind of new roles, new ways of working, and new ways of making sure that we really understand the kind of business that we want to kind of take forward for the next 3 or 4 generations. Now, this brings me to the hidden advantage that I spoke about earlier. The families that recognize this, the ones who intentionally prepare their daughters for leadership, they have a massive competitive advantage. I watched this transformation happen. Sometimes, they give their daughters like proper mentorship, proper training, proper exposure to the strategic partners I mentioned earlier, and not just working in the business, but also learning how the business appears and functions to others as well. That's a huge strategic advantage, right? And I definitely recommend this if you have both daughters and sons. So like, don't just, sidelight the sons and do this just for the daughters, right? But like, make sure that if you're trying to expose your children to the business, that you're not just letting them work in the business, but like they're also getting to know like those partners, those people outside the business who really make the business tick. Great. So if you're a daughter watching this, or a son wondering if you have what it takes, you absolutely do. But hoping and waiting is not a strategy. Hope is not a strategy, despite what Obama said. And I love Obama, but hope is not a strategy. You have to prepare. You have to make sure that you have the business knowledge, the technical knowledge, the person-to-person knowledge as well to make sure that business succeeds. You need to be intentional about building capacity, right? So you don't just wake up one day and say, hey, I would love to take over that business. But you need to be intentional about building capacity. That looks different for different people. For some people, it's going to business school, right? Some people feel like they need an MBA or they need like an undergrad in business to really understand how business works. And that is a great path for some. And for others, they don't need that. They don't need to necessarily have the MBA behind their name to know what they're doing, right? For others, it's like, how maybe I can go on a secondment to other businesses that are either similar to ours, right? Or in a different industry, but like it has like an adjacent size of business to ours. For some people, learning kind of on the job, but in a different industry or for a different business is extremely valuable training. So that is like their version of their MBA live in a different way. So they're not necessarily going to school to just learn the theory of entrepreneurship, to just learn the theory of running a business, doing your case studies and all of that, but they're actually learning it live inside a business. And for them, that's their way of building capacity. Now, great. So there's different ways you can do that. I'll go more into that in a different video, but let's talk about going forward now. The question really isn't whether succession will happen. It's whether your family will be one of the 12% that thrives across generations or the 88% that doesn't make it. So when you're looking at family office succession, really only like 12% of businesses make it to the third generation, right? Sometimes there's a different outcome that's required. Sometimes the business kind of flops, right? In which case there's nothing to pass on to the next generation. It happens, life happens. Most businesses fail within a certain number of years, right? So that does happen. And sometimes the business is sold. So like sometimes by the time the second generation is running it, they realize that they can get a better financial deal by selling it instead of passing it on to the next generation. So sometimes selling is the right option. If you look at the financials, right, and the time it takes to run the business, and you know, depending on whether people are in a state of mind to let that business go, sometimes selling is the best option. But then if you're a family that wants to transition that business to the next generation, then you have to think about how that succession looks like, right? Does it look like passing it on to a son or a daughter? Does it look like passing it on to a niece? Does it look like passing it on to an uncle or like a cousin? Because succession also doesn't have to be linear, but like either way you look at it, there has to be a transition of power because people don't live forever as much as we love them, right? So these things are completely fixable. The kind of the next generation that I work with, they don't necessarily need to become different people, right? They just kind of need the right preparation. And that's what I work with them on. So figuring out where are you now and like what do you want to do in the business in the next 5 years. So like if you're gunning for a chief operations officer role or a chief executive officer role, what are the things we need to do to prepare the version of you that's there today to become that version in 5 years? And so that's kind of like what I work with them on. In the next video, I'm going to show you what that looks like. I'll also mention some of the advantages that women bring to family business leadership, but also I want this to be inclusive. So I'm not saying that men cannot take over, that men shouldn't take over, but I want to make sure that we're also kind of bringing daughters up into consideration for the next level. So subscribe so you don't miss it. If this resonated with you, leave a comment. I read every single one. I'll also put in some resources in the comment section. So for example, I have a book about succession that you might want to read. I have a workbook where we also talk about you know, the things that you can work through and figure out what do I want my succession to look like. And if you're interested in looking for jobs at a family office, I also put a link for that as well in the comment section, so you can kind of see where you would get some like links to some of these jobs to test out work at other businesses. So thank you for listening. Leave a comment and I'll see you in the next video.